President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed into law 3 pieces of legislation aimed at enhancing the fight against gender-based violence. In a statement, he said the new laws will strengthen the criminal justice system, promote accountability, and put support for survivors at the center. To help me unpack the new laws and whether they will strengthen the fight against gender-based violence is researcher and gender activist Nomboniso Gasa, Director for Wise for Africa, Advocate Brenda Madumise-Pajibo, and sexual offences researcher Lisa Vetten. Right, let's get your views also tonight on 072-110-5584. That's the WhatsApp number where you can send your comments and questions tonight for our panel, or otherwise you can tweet us at Newzroom 405. Good evening, ladies, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. And as I mentioned in that introduction, Advocate Brenda, the amendments really are to better regulate the way in which government department, I suppose, law enforcement agencies, courts respond to cases of gender-based violence. Now, in many instances, the criminal justice system response is viewed as a tertiary response to the issues of gender-based violence. So they happen after the event. So it's support and the sanctions that are being given to the perpetrators. How important is this tertiary response to be as watertight as we are seeking to make it?
Good evening. The pieces of legislation will be watertight provided that we give them the necessary resources to, one, ensure that those charged with the responsibility of executing those pieces of legislation understand them correctly, apply them correctly, and they change their attitude. One of the biggest challenge has been how South African Police Service, the courts themselves, from the clerks and the prosecutors and magistrates, how they have been addressing and attending to gender-based violence cases. So they can be good on paper, and we're quite satisfied to an extent that we have these amendments, but this requires the state to put the necessary resources, meaning that every single police officer in this country needs to be aware of these amendments, their implications, and once they do not comply with the provisions of these amendments, what are the consequences? That has to be uppermost in the workings of the South African Police Service. Same as the court system. The prosecutors, the clerks need to understand what these amendments mean and how they address gender-based violence, how they deal with cases once a victim or any individual who wishes to open a case of gender-based violence, once they want to have a protection order, what are the steps that should be undertaken and followed by the officers themselves? So for me, yes, it's a step in the right direction, but please give the matching resources to the institutions, the South African Police Service, to the courts, so that they can address, but also every police officer is aware of what is contained in this piece of legislation. Not just the police service, not just the prosecutors, the clerks and the magistrates and the judges, but also the South African public as a whole. They need to know. There has to be a campaign from government now to highlight the importance of these amendments and what do they mean for you and I.
I'll come back to you in a moment to find out how exactly do we highlight that and make it a part of you and I and our daily lived experience. But Nomboniso, how does a criminal law amendment protect citizens against gender-based violence if we do not, I suppose, address the primary prevention strategies, the structural causes of gender-based violence, including attitudes, including values, beliefs, inequality that underpins the gendered forms of abuse and vulnerability in South Africa?
Thank you very much. I think that where Brenda ended about a campaign that government needs to undertake and drive and ensure that every corner of this country is made aware of the kind of crisis that we have and the urgency in addressing this. I think it's very important we can discuss different ideas around how that campaign would look, would unfold and how it should look like. But I also think that most importantly, the structural causes of gender-based violence and femicide are very, very complex. And there is no singular way in which you can say we are addressing the structural causes. So in the first instance, at this level of the criminal justice system, it is important that government undertakes, together with civil society and other actors, an overhaul. I am of the view that one, the South African Police Services, as it is now, is not in a position to play the kind of role that it should. So there has to be a thinking that is outside of the box and looking at whether we agree, first and foremost, that gender-based violence and femicide are priority crimes in this country. If we agree that they are priority crimes, we then need to look at what kind of institutional framework at the level of the criminal justice system, that the police and everything in that stream, what kind of resources do we need to put in place? I am of the view today that you need to have a gender-based violence unit that is functioning outside of the chain of command of the South African police. And my reason is, one, you currently have a minister and a commissioner that are at war with themselves. That kind of conflict affects rank and file. It creates a police services that is completely disrupted by a whole range of other things outside of their primary function. Secondly, if we say that gender-based violence, the term pandemic has been thrown around, but if we say that we have reached a level, in fact, we've long reached this level, where this has to be a priority crime. So I would imagine that we then need to pull a certain component of police services. You have them outside of that, almost like the NDPP, but what you have a function, a one-stop center where they can look at investigation, at response to cases, at the forensic technical skills that are needed, and building that up, the backlog of DNA and all these things. I do not believe that today, as we have the South African Police Services, that they are in a position to lead, in terms of their role in dealing with this priority crime. And I think that if you were to have that, one, it communicates that even though we are not able to address the structural causes of gender-based violence overnight, we do take this level of crime as a priority. We understand that this crime, secondly, we understand that the nature of gender-based violence and femicide is such that we've got to have a cross-cutting approach. And we have to make sure that on our side, we are putting all the resources that we have. Brenda has spoken about putting resources behind these new amendments and of course, long existing legislation. I'm saying where you have people in my village, for example, dealing with women, with elderly women, over and over again, that are robbed when they get their social grants, that are raped, and that are murdered. Here I'm talking about, just now in December, I'm talking about a woman in her 70s, in her late 70s, killed, raped and killed by a young man who could have been her grandchild. So we are, and you have the police, the nearest police station, they don't have fuel in their vans, they don't have the necessary training, they don't have the necessary empathy, and they don't have the necessary agency that is required. So right now, President Ramaphosa has amended these laws, but they are thrown back into a system that is dysfunctional. So I'm saying the level of dysfunction, the level of incompetence, the level of casual approach to these crimes, it certainly tells us that the South African Police Services are not able to come to the party right now. So they would have to pool experts. And here I'm thinking about a panel of experts that is cross-cutting You have your behavioral science.
I'm going to come back to you a little bit further more for that panel of experts and what we need to further improve the way in which our criminal justice system works. And Lisa, will come to you as well to weigh in as we take a break now. 072-110-5584. Here's a question for you. Does this amendment to the bill make sure, in your view, that all can access the criminal justice system with regards to sexual crimes and crimes of violence and intimidation? What are your thoughts? 072-110-5584. Tweet us at Newzroom405. We're back in a moment. Right, thanks for staying with us tonight here on In Focus. Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. As we zoom in closer to the amendments being made to the criminal law, sexual offences and related matters amendment bill announced earlier today by President Cyril Ramaphosa that these have been signed into law now in the country. Does the criminal law amendment actually go a long way, in your view, to protect citizens against gender-based violence? What are your thoughts tonight? 072-110-5584. Nomboniso Gasa, advocate Brenda Madumise-Pajibo, as well as Lisa Vetten, our guest tonight, in helping us in that conversation. That's a question, Lisa, for you. I mean, if you look at the amendments being done now, can we say they begin to deal with the limits of the criminal law in at least responding to gender-based violence? Because I don't think at this point they really go into preventing gender-based violence.
Well, to some extent, something like the domestic violence does. It prevents repeat violence, and that is incredibly important. And I think the other important aspects of legislation, like something like the domestic violence, is it has the potential to reduce children's exposure to violence. And we have a great deal of research to show that children, especially boys, who are routinely exposed to watching their fathers assault their mothers, are at high risk of potentially the same behavior as adults. So we shouldn't underestimate the benefits of some of this law. But I think what's important to do when we look at because there are actually 3 different laws that have been amended here. Some of these amendments are very valuable. Some of them, I'm afraid, represent a complete misdiagnosis of the problem. And they are not likely to make much difference at all. And those, I think, are the amendments around the sex offenders register, for instance. But I think if we look at one of the pieces that deal with criminal procedure, what's valuable about that is some of the new protections it provides to allow, especially for older witnesses, to testify through intermediaries. And the way it also removes the police's discretion to grant bail. This was a real problem in relation to domestic violence. Women would go to the police, lay charges, they would arrest him, a couple of hours, he's out again because the police have given him police bail. The amendments to the Criminal Procedure Amendment Act stop that. I think that's very useful. What I'm also excited about in relation to the Domestic Violence Act is the new duties it imposes on the health sector. And the health sector for far too long has really not gotten at all involved in domestic violence in the way they should. And we have a lot of evidence to show, as well as women's own experience, to show that in many instances, they're far more likely to go and seek help from a health worker with domestic violence than the courts. So to have not made them a key part of our response is a very serious oversight. So in terms of the amendments to the Domestic Violence Act, they're now going to have to develop directives giving instructions and guidelines to nurses and doctors around how they should respond when they have a woman coming into casualty for the 3rd time in a month who has been beaten. At the very least, you would hope that these directives will start to say, what are the kinds of questions you need to be asking? What are the kinds of referral networks that you need to be developing? How do we get women to shelters? So that we could start the basis of a much more comprehensive and holistic protection system that would start to bring shelters, police, courts and health workers into something that would really, I think, be able to respond much more directly and responsively, rather than just the response that we've had so far, where if the police don't respond, well, that's it, too bad. The misdiagnosis, I think, and I just want to pick up on something that Nomboniso was pointing to, is the Domestic Violence Act has been in effect since 1999. And from the outset, it made it misconduct for the police not to implement any of the provisions within the Domestic Violence Act. It's 2021, 2022. We have never been able to get the police to do that. And I'm afraid another law saying the same things about you must arrest immediately when they haven't done so in the last 20 years, and there's been nothing to change that practice, misdiagnoses the problem. And so that's where I think a real missed opportunity has been, that in relation to the police, it's not more law that we need.
Yeah.
It's something about understanding why they don't implement and what it is that needs to be done differently to make them implement.
Right.
And I'm afraid the amendments in the DVA are not going to do that.
Advocate Brenda, let's highlight then what needs to be done. Nomboniso has already mentioned some of the basic things like putting petrol into the cars or making sure that the cars are available. When you can actually pick up a phone and be guaranteed that somebody will respond. What else would need to be highlighted? Are those the only limitations that we're dealing with as far as maybe let's confine it now to the South African Police Service?
It's not just the South African Police Service. I mean, it's the entire value chain that has failed and continues to fail victims and survivors of gender-based violence and femicide. So what Nomboniso has touched on is something that we have been consistently and constantly trying to raise with the powers that be. If you claim that gender-based violence and femicide is a pandemic, and your response is that is lackadaisical and very nonchalant, then you are doing a disservice. You literally paying lip service and being performative, right? So if we are serious about tackling this pandemic that we say it every day that it's a pandemic, then your response has to demonstrate that it is a pandemic, and you need to literally rip the entire system and structure open so that then you come up with solutions that are going to be effective and efficient. And at the moment, what we're doing is we're putting a bandage on a septic wound and hoping that it heals, and it doesn't, and then we come back again and put another bandage, and that's what we've been doing for the many years. So if we are serious about, and the president and his team and the rest of us, because we keep on making the noises and putting pressure for a different thinking, a different approach, they still want to manage and really appease and think that they can pacify us by just giving us a little, and then we relax and then come up again a year or two later, guns blazing, and hopefully thinking that they will respond and give us something again as little as that. I think, as Nomboniso correctly points out, we need to overhaul the entire system. And in fact, what we as WISE has done is to take 2-3 cases to the public protector around the systematic failures of the South African Police Service. Now we understand that she's launching an inquiry around the systematic failures. And if we start to do that work and show South Africa where the failures are, then the solutions and the interventions must address those failures.
I suppose the investigation by the public protector will reveal the details of what you think are the systematic failures, but I suspect you already have in mind something that you think are the systematic failures.
No, we do, and I mean the last time we had this conversation around this subject matter was that if we are able to have in this country on corruption, we have brought in all the law enforcement agencies and all the actors into one room, and we call it what they call it, I forgot the words, but that's what you need. You need to bring, as Nomboniso said, bring every single individual as an expert and remove this thing and address the issues correctly so that you have the correct and the correct outcomes. If we continue to deal with it piecemeal like we're doing and not look at it holistically, where you through the strategic plan.
All right, Advocate Brenda, unfortunately that connection is failing us, so we'll try and get you back on a better line there. But so let me bring you in here. You are raising the question of a panel of experts to sit around the table, because it's good and well to say perpetrators will not be released on bail before first appearance at a lower court, right? How do we ensure that everybody in the system understands this, implements this, and puts this in place? And one would say there have been numerous instances where people have come around the table. I mean, the president at some point spent a whole day in a room where all these issues were being raised before him. How would a sit around a table assist us in making sure that the people who are responsible for implementing these laws actually take them seriously?
You know, if we look at the different interventions that we have had, they derive from the early 90s. So I think we are at a time we are primed as a country to review how we have dealt with gender-based violence holistically for more than 20 years now. So in the first instance, for me, it's not just about a panel of experts, but that they are part of, for example, if you had a panel of experts looking at the different amendments that have been made now, and saying, from a health perspective, we think these are the issues that need to be looked into from this perspective and so on. So as you start to reframe some of these laws, you bring in different experiences and expertise on the table. But even that doesn't go far enough. I am saying that, again, I'm saying that until you have a place, a centralized place, a centralized database where if somebody goes to the police in Zimbabwe to report rape, to report abuse in the home and so on, that is fed out immediately in a database. Even your National Register of Offenders is not going to go far enough as long as you are dependent on whether these pieces of information are imputed. Yeah. So that's the first thing. So you need a one-stop shop where it's at the level of the database, where it's at the level of the personnel that is available to you. Secondly, you need to be able to have an immediate monitoring that is happening in the system. If a police officer is taking the statement from a survivor who has gone to report, you need to have it in such a way that the system can pick up that there are certain details that you have not fed into this information. Because at that level, if mistakes are made at that level, it affects whether the investigation is effective, whether the investigation leads to arrest, and a whole range of other things, including police bail, yeah, and so on. That requires a rethinking and a reframing of what we think gender-based violence and femicide is in this country, how it intersects with a whole range of things. On top of that, I am saying that over and above all the other weaknesses that we know we have in the system, you have a distracted leadership of South African police services, because that's the leadership we're discussing now. Yeah. And this is very central in rethinking and in rebuilding a different culture around this, because they are central in the criminal justice system. Yeah. Now, related to your question about whether prevention actually has any impact on causes, I think we need to understand that we can't be mechanistic about this. Children, emulate the behavior that they see. So if, for example, a child knows that a teacher who molested a girl at some point and so on and so forth, that teacher lost his job, that teacher is on the national register, that teacher is in jail, that has an impact on how they think about gender-based violence. But over and above that, this structure that I'm suggesting should have an oversight, but also implementation. Right. Then begins to assist government in terms of the kind of campaigns and the kind of information that is communicated. You have, for example, government saying that the levels of gender-based violence and femicide are unacceptable in this country. But on any given day, you have politicians, very senior politicians, making distasteful statements that allude to to sexual relations with women, or how they view women and so on. And this is on national television. So on the one hand, there's this message that gender-based violence and femicide is not accepted, that objectification of women is not accepted, that sexual harassment at work is a no-no. But on the other hand, the culture that permeates at the level of politicians who lead in this country, in fact, is completely in contradiction with that. So in a way, you need a conversation that says this is the conduct that is acceptable. We cannot have a minister, a woman minister, talking to another politician, and you have this male politician undressing her in public, with his eyes. So it's the small things, but also it's the bigger things, because here we are talking about an entire ecosystem of patriarchy, an ecosystem that objectifies women, an ecosystem that has absolutely no respect for women's bodies, for girls' bodies, for the way in which sexuality of women should not be treated in the way that it is.
Let's take a break. We'll come back in a moment. Advocate Brenda, I'm going to bring you in once again because I want you to explain a little bit, particularly around some of these amendments and what they actually mean as having been a part of the panel as well. All right, stay with us and let's get your views tonight. 072-110-5584. Or you can tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. Back with you tonight here on In Focus Newzroom Afrika, channel 405, discussing that all-important matter of the amendment to 3 bills that were put before Parliament, and the President saying they are now have now been signed into law, certainly to make the fight against gender-based violence in the country a little bit more robust. Advocate Brenda, I wanted to say to you, for example, let's talk about protection orders now go onto a central depository, right? What does that mean, and what assurance must that give me as a citizen that because the protection order is in a depository, the officer is actually going to bother to look into the computer and find it in the depository and say, well, this guy is a repeated offender and therefore cannot escape the might of the law. Please unmute for us if you can.
Apologies. So the repository is beneficial in a number of ways. Remember, at the moment you are dealing with piece of papers that disappears. Sometimes your docket disappears, or even yourself, you lose that piece of paper that you have given that is your protection order. Or and in certain instances, when you have to travel to another province and your perpetrator follows you, and you go to the next police station in that province, they cannot assist you because they don't have a central database of where these protection orders are stored, and that's the purpose of the repository, so that we minimize the corruption and the bribery that happens with all these matters. We get to see that victims are assisted, and that at any given time, or at the press of a button, at a police station, at a court, you can access this information. In fact, I think one of the things that is missing, and it was a big thing that was made and announced by the Minister of Justice and everyone else, was that we are going to be automating the protection order system, and we still want to push that it gets automated, that I don't have to go into a court to apply for a protection order if I can sit in the comfort of my home, for those of us who can, and apply for this protection order, and I can be assisted. And I keep on saying to South Africans, until you experience having to apply for a protection order, you will not understand what it does to an individual who has to go before a magistrate court to apply for that order. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done with the protection order to have a seamless, smooth process that gives victims of gender-based violence some dignity and integrity in this process. And I would challenge many of you to go out into these courts and see what happens in a domestic violence court, and see the treatment of the many victims who are there looking for a service and empathy from clerks of courts and those assisting, and they don't get it, and they're sent from pillar to post, and your life is in danger, and no one is treating it with urgency and with respect. So the changes that are being introduced are supposed to address some of these things. And at some point, we're dealing with individuals who must appreciate their role as servants and public servants, right? That this behavior and conduct that they mete out to the citizens is unacceptable, and there will be consequences in the event that they are found to be, to flout the rules, and even their conduct is unbecoming. And unless we start to do that and demonstrate our seriousness in how we deal with these issues, and I mean, when we look at how many cases of women, and South Africa wants to equate my experience, lived experience, when I say I have been violated, the first thing that everyone says is that, have you reported to the courts? And because we think that the courts are the only ones that can establish whether I'm telling the truth or not telling the truth. So you would want that system to work and work effectively, so that you don't compromise the integrity of the many victims who then report some of these cases. So on the protection orders, I mean, I'm hoping that the budget is made available, that we are not going to be caught up in a prolonged, protracted procurement process to find service providers who are going to put this system together and start to make it work. But understand, it's a system, it relies on human beings. Yes. And if you don't deal with the human beings and deal with their conduct and their attitude, we're still going to have some of these problems that we're talking about.
So certainly. Lisa, expand for me a little bit on why you believe the National Register Offences approach is still lacking, or still at least limited. I mean, they're saying now it's going to include offenders beyond those convicted of sexual offences, and it's going to also include, I think, ID numbers that are going to be attached to it, and so on and so forth. It's also now going to be, I suppose, available, but available to who is still a big question as to who will be able to access it.
Well, a register is useful in relation to children and people with intellectual disabilities, because we know enough to see that there are certain types of offenders who will go and look for work at schools or in homes in order to have access to those particular categories of people in order to abuse them. So it's very useful to have a register for those purposes. What the register has done is now said that those kinds of, and what the register has previously said is that if you work in that kind of facility and you're seeking to employ somebody, any prospective employee has to be checked against that register. So that's useful in cases of schools and residential facilities for people with intellectual disabilities. The register has now just expanded that to residential facilities or community service centres that deal with older persons, that would be those over 60. It's also extended it to those who are working with young women up until about the age of 25 in a range of different educational settings. So your TVET colleges as well as your universities and your other kinds of colleges. That I don't believe, and it's also extended it to those who work in in shelters for victims of crime. I do not believe the new additions are in any way useful, to be quite frank. The first reason for that is that and I'll speak here from my experience of having worked in universities, disciplinary tribunals, and having worked on policy and having worked in preparing cases. The vast and overwhelming majority of cases in universities do not get reported to the police. They get dealt with by disciplinary tribunals. You only go onto the register if you have been convicted in a criminal court. So therefore, the vast majority of those who have been disciplined, who have been dismissed, or who have gone through disciplinary tribunals, and this goes for schools as well, will never ever end up on a sex offenders register because they have not been convicted in a court of law. So you are losing a whole category of those who are a risk to others by not thinking more broadly about what you do with disciplinary tribunals. And so in the case of universities, you need a very different kind of register if it's going to be effective and if you're going to be doing something about those who get accused of something, simply resign and move on to another university. So that was a case where I don't think there was sufficient thought given and enough diagnosis made of what are the problems in relation to universities. When it comes to the shelters for victims of crime, those are domestic violence shelters. 99% of those who work in domestic violence shelters are women, who tend not to be guilty of sex offences. In all the years I have worked, I have never, ever heard of a single shelter ever complaining about one of its staff sexually abusing any one of its residents. So I don't know where that particular problem came from. And thirdly, shelters already have to check their staff against the sex offenders register because shelters carry children. So, those are not helpful or meaningful interventions in any way.
Yeah.
What would have been more useful would be, I think, a separate register for universities that would look at where somebody is disciplined or dismissed on a disciplinary basis, and that would be held by the Department of Higher Education and Training. That would be more meaningful in the university setting. It would also be much more useful, I think, at school level. Yeah. Again, because so many of your offenders are going through disciplinary inquiries to look at how do you amalgamate the sex offenders register and the National Child Protection Register. So I think there's some misthinking that's happened here around how you better address those particular difficulties. And then I think the last thing we have to keep in mind when it comes to sex offenders registers, I spoke about you only going on them if there's been a criminal conviction. And if we bear in mind that only between 7 to 8% of cases are resulting in convictions, you must know that the vast majority of those who commit such crimes are never going to end up on a register. So I think a register is useful when it comes to children and people with intellectual disabilities, but we need to think much more creatively and in different ways if we want to think about other forms of protection to other vulnerable categories in society.
Right, let's take a break. We'll come back in a moment and wrap up the conversation with our panel tonight. Nomboniso Gasa, advocate Brenda Madumise-Pajibo, as well as Lisa Vetten, and your views tonight on 072-110-5584 to the release of that statement by the President that is now signed into law, these 3 amendments to the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Bill. Stay with us. Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us tonight. You're in Focus, and the conversation continues now with a panel: Nomboniso Gasa, advocate Brenda Madumise-Pajibo, and Lisa Vetten. Nomboniso, I'll take the benefit of you being my panel of experts here today, and let's sit around the table and discuss, for example, one of the amendments, right? One of the issue is how to further regulate the issues surrounding the reporting duty of persons who are aware of sexual offences being committed against children, and what it means, the failure to report this. How would we put that into implementation in a way that would be effective? Because a lot of people see these things happening, right? Where we hear in court, for example, that the perpetrator went and asked for CCTV footage, and nobody cares to ask and go further to say what was actually going on here, right? And that matter never gets reported until it is discovered later that somebody has been murdered.
Look, I think there's a whole range of issues there that arise from that. For example, if people see that abuse is happening, we think that they ought to feel compelled to go and report it, that they ought to feel that they can advocate on behalf of this minor. But are they even aware that, or do they necessarily subscribe to the thinking that says this should not happen? Because a lot of these things, other people explain it away and say, well, take a cultural practice, that is comfortable with probing of teenagers. And then on that, you can have sometimes a scale of abuse that is happening. Now, who advocates for them? But most importantly, if I go today and I want to advocate for a child, do I know where I'm going to go? do I feel secure myself and protected, that I can go and advocate for this child and that nothing is going to happen to me. So a lot of the burden and responsibilities that we put on citizens have another flip side to it, which is the strain and the stress that happens again on citizens. And this happens at workplace, for example. You can see Brenda can come and say, I'm being sexually harassed by Nomboniso because of this and that and that, therefore I want this action to take place. But does she receive an enabling environment? Is she in an enabling environment? Does she feel secure enough to go and then actually report and know that there's going to be no consequence to her? So I think that a number of these changes assume a pre-existing environment that encourages the kinds of actions that we want to see. But we also need to talk about the burden and the stress that is being put on citizens and on families. In the communities that I come from, you have had situations where a young person who has committed this crime and killed an elderly woman, this is about 7 years ago, is known in the community. But the police, because there's not sufficient evidence and whatever else that happens there, this child walks around in the community. So what do you expect the community to do? What do you think are the conclusions that they're going to draw in terms of the criminal justice system? How then does it mean that my neighbor, when she sees something else, that she feels confident that she can report this? This happens in communities in South Africa everywhere, where you have councillors who, in fact, in one way or the other, represent government. They become part of the problem, or they themselves become intimidated in terms of coming to action. So I think, so if I look at some of these amendments that have been made now, but also the entire pieces of legislation that deal with gender-based violence and femicide, I still want to say that before it is finally signed by the president into an act of parliament, I think that there has to be another intervention. People that can sit with him and say, well, this doesn't go far enough. This is cosmetic. This is, and because we don't have this, so he relies to ministers. Ministers rely on their support staff and all of that. But part of what you see in some of these amendments, they also speak to where the bill came from and the debate in 2018. Since 2018, it's now what, 4 years. Other forms of behavior, other problems have surfaced. So there's not been a timeline where you say, okay, the bill was drafted in this time. Before it is signed, can we then just do a final round of check and see whether this does speak to what is happening in communities and whether this does speak to what experts, in fact, are writing about at this moment. So I think that if over and above all the other checks and balances that had gone, there was this other final step before it is signed, I think that then there would have been a conversation that says, well, maybe this is has fallen by the wayside. Yeah. Maybe this, if you don't do this in this way, it is meaningless. So I think we do need those kinds of conversations, right. But I keep going back to this thing of saying we have a problem in this country in the sense that even though we talk about intersectionality, even though we talk about how everything is connected to another, in the final analysis, we end up looking at some of these things from a silo perspective. Right. So I would like, for example, to know to what extent has the health ministry been involved in some of these reviews? Yeah. To what extent has the economic cluster been part of these reviews? Because gender-based violence and femicide is not only a criminal justice system issue. Right. It is also a structural issue. It speaks to power relations, the economy, and a whole range of other things. And I think it is high time that we see this interconnection playing a major role in our legislation, not only on this, but also a whole range of other legislations.
Advocate Brenda, we have a minute or so left. Just touch on what the thinking was around the intervention of the National Register, why it didn't go further beyond just those who are convicted of sexual offences.
This was a contested terrain. I mean, the NGOs that even submitted, I mean, it was mind-boggling, the kinds of arguments that were made during the submissions and the oral submissions in Parliament. And I think even Parliament itself, the Portfolio Committee, enlisted the services of consultants to undertake a desktop study on other jurisdictions in the world to see how this is dealt with, right? And because the arguments that were being made were that you're taking away the rights of these perpetrators when you start to publish their name, you take away the right to privacy and all those things. And that's why I think it came out as muddied as it has come out, right? And there was not proper think through of it on how it will manifest itself once you sign this into law.
Yeah,
now, and Lisa is correct in saying that majority of some of these cases, and that's why most perpetrators of these acts have gotten away with murder, precisely because we don't get to hear and the conclusion of a disciplinary process at the university, for instance. We have had cases of lecturers and professors who have sexually harassed their students or even other women lecturers, and there's a process at the university. It gets concluded, there's a confidentiality signed or is not signed, and that lecturer moves to another university. There's no record of that individual. Yeah. So we're missing the majority of these cases because there's no mandatory requirement that they should be listed. Now, what needs to happen is, because higher education has had its own gender-based violence policy, they need to look at it and say, how do we marry and try and synchronize with what is coming out from this piece of legislation, so that there's a record even at universities, at TVET colleges. There's a record even in the private sector, by the way, where this happens, that it is requirement, and in fact maybe through, I suppose, the ILO convention is
I think
already done.
Indeed, I'm going to come in there because of time. I appreciate you, ladies, and thank you very much for coming through. I think that panel of experts certainly something that is a brilliant idea that needs to be interrogated a little bit further to come and sit down with these amendments. But thank you for coming on tonight and helping us further understand the meaning and the impact of these amendments.